Hello everybody, welcome to Free Kiwis. Today we're very pleased to welcome Professor Kendall Clements from the University of Auckland. Now Kendall is a professor in the School of Biological Sciences there. He was also co-author of a now infamous letter to the listener about the relationship between mātauranga Māori and science, and we'll get onto that pretty soon. But first of all, Kendall, tell us a bit about your research. I believe it has something to do with fish, is that right?
Yes, I'm basically a fish biologist. I started out doing my master's degree actually here at Auckland, where I ended up, under the supervision of Professor Howard Choate, on looking at the diets and the feeding anatomy of herbivorous fish in New Zealand. And I then did my PhD with Howard, who had in the meantime shifted to James Cook University in Townsville, where they do a lot of coral reef research. And so I did my PhD on herbivorous surgeonfish on coral reefs. I then did a couple of postdocs at the University of Sydney, where I was based in biological sciences, but I actually worked day to day in the biochemistry department, and I became very interested in the role that gut symbionts in some of these fish play in digesting the algae that they feed on. And so I've worked on that a lot. We have a large MB grant to work on that at the moment, looking at the gut symbionts and what they do with the algae. And I also have quite a bit of research going on with a PhD student, Georgina Nicholson, who was working on parrotfish diets. And so we found some very interesting things out about them too.
So when you say gut symbionts, you mean these are microorganisms that live in the gut of the fish and assist the fish to digest the algae? Is that the story?
That's the story. Yeah. I mean, this happens in our guts. Mm-hmm. There's a lot known about the importance of the gut microbiome. You'll have seen lots of popular articles on what gut bacteria do. What they're doing in the fish is they convert the complex sugars that are in the seaweed into compounds called short-chain fatty acids, which are essentially waste products in the anaerobic. There's no oxygen in the gut, at least in the part of the gut where these bacteria live, the back part of the gut, the hind gut towards the end. And by converting these complex sugars, things like cell wall materials and so on, into these short chain fatty acids, the fish are then able to take that up. They assimilate those, and in the presence of oxygen, they can then use those for metabolism, for energy, and they can also use them for lipid storage to store energy as fat. So the gut symbionts in some of these fish, not all of the fish, parrotfish, for example, are not hind gut fermenters, but the fish that feed on things like kelps in particular usually have very complex relationships with these gut communities. There are, sort of 10 to the 11, 10 to the 12 bacteria per mil living in their gut, very active rates of fermentation. And these bacteria are obviously critical to the digestion, nutrition, and health of the host fish.
Mm-hmm. So there's 10 to the 12 bacteria living in these fish guts. They're pretty small bacteria, and I understand that most bacteria are pretty small compared to me. But I saw that you also have a paper called The Largest Bacterium. So can you talk about, that's a nature thing. Well, is that bacterium bigger than me? How worried should we be about the size of this?
Yeah, how long have you got? So when I started my PhD, Howard Choate pointed out a paper that was published in the mid-1980s by Lev Fischelson, Arthur Merberg, and Lynn Montgomery on these giant organisms that they call protists that live in the gut of surgeonfish, and these guys were working at Eilat in southern Israel, although Lynn's and Arthur Merberg are based in the States. And Howard said, why don't you see if they're also in the gut of fish at Lizard Island? So I collected some of the same species and found exactly the same organisms there. In the area of the northern Red Sea where these guys were working, there are only sort of 3 or 4 species of surgeonfish. There are about 35, you know, in the vicinity of Lizard Island, and I looked at a whole range of them, and I found all sorts of similar looking organisms in other surgeonfish that they hadn't seen. And so I started to become very interested in this. And during my first summer, Lynn showed up at Lizard Island, where I was doing my PhD fieldwork, and he didn't know I was there. He was going around the world sort of saying, well, I'm now going to go to other places and see if I can find these organisms. He described them in 1988, well, one species of them, as Epulopiceum fischelsoni. Fischelson, that's naming it after Lev Fischelson, who was on the initial science paper. And he, Epulopiceum, the genus name, means guest at the banquet of a fish, which was a cute name. Anyway, lots of people in his position. I mean, he was a senior established scientist. He'd been working on this for a while. And here I was a PhD student, and I already collected a whole lot of samples. But lots of people in his position would have just bulldozed right through and just sort of ignored me. But not Lynn. He said, he said, well, you've already done all of this. I don't need to do this, and I'll help you in whatever way I can. And he did. And you know, we've been friends since, and I've stayed at his house twice. He lives in Flagstaff, Arizona. He's a lovely man. And so when I started doing some more work on them, as I said, they describe them as a protist, and protists are generally, that just means single-celled organism. They were thinking that these were something like a eukaryote, like an amoeba, or but they were shaped like a cigar, but they got up to in fact, over 0.5 millimeter long, over 500, 600 microns. That's so 500 microns is 0.5 millimeter. And you can actually,
is there any other cell that large anywhere?
There's one that is a spherical thing, but it is sort of 98% nitrate vacuole. So it's like a soccer ball, with the actual bacteria part being say the leather of the soccer ball, and the inside of it is just filled with kind of, you know, nutrient-rich fluid. But these epulos they're shaped exactly like cigars. I mean, they vary a bit, but the big ones that these guys had worked on in the Red Sea are cigar-shaped. They're very unusual. They're highly motile, and but anyway, when I started sequencing them, Howard said, well, I know this guy back in Auckland, Stan Bullivant, you've done some electron microscope work. He's an expert on electron microscopes. Why don't you take him some of the photos and show him? So I did. Stan looked at these and said, these are bacteria. And I said, they can't be bacteria because they're too big. And he said, no, they're definitely bacteria. He said, can you get some more samples? So I went back to Lizard Island and I fixed things specifically in the way he wanted to fix them. We did freeze fracture microscopy and so on. And we showed 3 different lines of evidence that they were bacteria. They had bacterial type flagella. They didn't have a nuclear membrane. That's one of the differences between bacteria and what are called eukaryotes. Humans are eukaryotes. So are fungi, and you know, anything with a nucleus is a eukaryote. And so they didn't have a nuclear membrane, and they had this characteristic fixation pattern of the chromosome, the DNA. That looks different under particular types of fixation in bacteria to the way it looks in these eukaryotic organisms with nuclei.
Mm-hmm.
So we had those 3 lines of evidence. We submitted it to the journal Science, and it was rejected. They just didn't believe us. They said, no, you're wrong. You don't know what you're doing, and so on. So we submitted it to Nature and got word for word the same review, although we'd actually specified that we knew what we were sectioning, because these things are so big that when you embed them in a block, which is this acrylic resin, you stain them with osmium tetroxide, which makes them go black. So you could see them under the dissecting scope that you use when you're doing the sectioning. to cut the thin sections to look at under the electron microscope. So we knew exactly what we were sectioning. But anyway, they said, no, you just don't know what you're doing. And it's the only time in his life that I ever saw Stan get angry, because he was one of the people who invented freeze fracture electron microscopy. And so, yes, he wasn't very amused at this. So he got in touch with Carl Woese, who's a very, very famous microbiologist. He was actually the person who kind of first came up with looking at the evolutionary relationships of different bacteria. And he said, well, I'm largely retired, but I'm going to put you in touch with a former student of mine at the University of Indiana called Norman Pace. And so we got in touch with Norman, and Norman said, well, this is really interesting. He said, there are lots of ditches around here in Indiana. Do you think if we go and, collect some fish from the, streams and ditches here, do you think we might see these? And I said, well, I think it's fairly unlikely, because I said, I've looked at quite a few different types of fish at Lizard Island, and the only ones I find them in are some surgeonfish. And so it's, anyway, so he put a PhD student onto this called Esther Angett. And I currently collaborate with Esther. So we've been collaborating ever since then. And she sequenced the genes from these things. They're so big that you can see, as I said, you can see them under a dissecting microscope. And so she was able to isolate some cells under a dissecting scope, get the DNA out of them, sequence them, and show that they were bacteria. And so what happened was, when she got these preliminary results, he said, well, because Esther's done that work, she has to be first author on the paper. But he said, you actually figured out that these things were bacteria. So what we're going to do is I will write to the Journal of Bacteriology, and we will support you in getting an initial paper published saying that you know that they're not eukaryotes. I mean, there could have been something completely novel. Mm-hmm. But anyhow, so that was published, and then Esther's paper was published on the cover of Nature in 1993.
So this is a very interesting story to me, from the perspective of what it takes to get, quite novel ideas accepted by a scientific community. And I guess, the experience with science and then with nature certainly were frustrating. But I suppose we might reflect and see that this is actually the way things should work in science, because what you come up with here was a pretty surprising thing, perhaps, that, I'm no cell biologist, but, a cell that is half a millimetre in diameter sounds like it would push the limits of what is structurally possible for a cell. And so perhaps we might reflect that in science, it is a good thing that you got some pushback to make sure that what you'd found was the genuine article, and not, because of course, there are, you may remember in the 1990s, there was a false start on cold fusion, and there was a paper published in Nature from a couple of researchers claiming that they'd managed to achieve nuclear fusion at room temperature, which turned out to be not true, even after the paper was published. And of course, the science corrected itself in that instance as well. But what are your reflections on the process of science in respect of this particular discovery that you've made?
Well, you may have a point with respect to the review that we got from Science, which was the original one. But when we revised the paper and submitted it to Nature, we specified that we could see these things in the block. So we knew exactly what we were sectioning, but we got word for word the same review. Mm-hmm. So it was the same reviewer. They didn't read the revised, they just assumed that we had submitted the same paper. They didn't read it and just chucked in the same review. So you're completely right that peer review is a self-correcting mechanism. And this is a critical feature of science that distinguishes it from, other forms of knowledge. But you've got to do the review properly.
Yes. So I guess, science, like anything else, is subject to the flaws of human beings. And in this case, obviously, it was unfortunate that the paper was sent to the same reviewer, and then that reviewer didn't read it afresh. So I see what you mean.
Anyway, this is probably a good point to turn to what we wanted to talk about next, which is the whole debate about science and Mātauranga Maori. We have a few international listeners, also some listeners within New Zealand who maybe aren't aware of the controversy. So I wonder if you could just start by laying out what happened, what was in the letter that you and some colleagues wrote to the listener, and what was the reaction?
Well, we first started talking about including Mātauranga Māori in our biology undergraduate teaching, I think in about 2016, when we underwent a curriculum review. And we started, it was suggested that we should just start teaching it in certain papers. And we, at that time, we had completely revised our stage one, our first year papers. And the paper that I was involved in teaching was going to become an evolution and ecology paper. And so they said, well, we're going to have components on Mātauranga Māori in the ecology component, but it was also suggested more broadly that Mātauranga Māori should be taught throughout all different courses. I think it's important that I give you a definition of Mātauranga Māori. Exactly how you define Mātauranga Māori, people differ in it, but the definition I'm going to give you is not my one. It's the Royal Society of New Zealand definition. And if people want to find this, it's in their Code of Professional Standards in Ethics in Science, Technology and the Humanities, Interpretation 2019. So this is a document that the Royal Society of New Zealand produced in 2019. This particular bit I'm going to read to you is on page 4, it's footnote 10. Mātauranga Māori is the intellectual capital generated by whānau, hapu and iwi, so that means families, sort of groups of families and tribes, back to the quote, over multiple generations. It is a shared community knowledge that is embedded in lived experience and carried in stories, song, place names, dance, ceremonies, genealogies, memories, visions, prophecies, teachings, and original instructions, as learnt through observation and copying of other community members. It is a holistic system of orally passed knowledge, concepts, beliefs, and practice. And it goes on to say Mātauranga Māori is a dynamic, innovative, and generative system of knowledge. So I don't think I'll be attacked for using the Royal Society of New Zealand definition. Quite clearly, this was put together with input from Māori. But nobody should make the mistake of thinking that so that is Mātauranga Māori. Exactly how you use it in relation to other forms of activity or knowledge, there is considerable difference in viewpoint among Māori scholars. So as you can see, hopefully, I mean, it includes memories, visions, prophecies, ceremonies, dance. It includes, essentially, it's Māori cultural knowledge, Māori knowledge. It's like the entire corpus of what Māori know about existence and how they feel about things. It includes spirituality. It includes, the Māori pantheon, Atua, Ranganui, Papatuanuku, Māori gods, all sorts of oral histories, everything. So when somebody says, we are now going to teach this in science, what concerned me was, well, some of this might be science-like, and you might think of things like the enormous intellectual achievements that Māori made in celestial navigation. They found virtually every rock in the Southwest Pacific. And I you know, like most other people, I look on this as a tremendous intellectual achievement. It's very complex the way they did this. I listened to a very interesting talk about this at the Marine Sciences meeting in July. But so, you know, they were familiar with stars. They knew that, you know, as you headed south, the position of the stars changed. They were able to navigate using that. But it's more complex than that. It also involved an understanding of ocean currents, the temperature of the water. They were able to, you know, roughly figure out how fast they were going. And so they had a pretty good idea of where they were when they were in various places. It wasn't just like they randomly set sail and hoped they bang into something. It was much more sophisticated than that. They also had a sophisticated calendar, which they used to schedule annual activities like various types of harvest, including kumara, and so on. So these are things that are certainly science-like. There are other activities that we might think of directly related to, say, areas of current ecological interest. And a good example of that is Kauri dieback. We have these very large native trees in New Zealand called kauri, and they get this fungal pathogen that causes problems. Historically, because kauri trees were considered taonga, treasures by Maori, I'm talking about prior to European arrival, they would do things like put poultices on the trees if the trees somehow got damaged or appeared to have some sort of disease. They would try and cure the trees. And so you can think, well, could some of these traditional remedies, rongoa, which is herbal remedies, and of course Maori had all sorts of herbal remedies to treat human ailments, like, you know, if you have a stomach ache or a headache or something like that. Most Indigenous people came up with remedies for things like that, and some of these may contain novel compounds that might be of interest to modern medicine, for example. So you can easily see how aspects of this are science. But my concern in the beginning was, if we just say we are now going to teach mātauranga Maori in science class, does that mean we're going to be teaching song, carving, you know, ceremonies, that sort of thing? Or are we just going to teach the sciencey abstract aspects of it? And nobody wanted to say anything about how we were going to do that. And I was particularly concerned because I taught evolution. And from time to time, I had students who were quite clearly religious, and they would say, well, you've told us what you wanted to, you know, your views of evolution. Now I want to explain my views of evolution. Of course, they wanted to then talk to the class about creationism. And my response at the time was to say, well, I appreciate that, you know, people have religious views. This is a science class, and because it's a science class, we're going to teach it from a science perspective. And so I managed to, you know, essentially ensure that I didn't have to teach creationism as well. Mm. But what we were doing by introducing mātauranga Maori, qua mātauranga Maori, in other words, if we just say, well, now we're going to teach the whole thing in science class, did that mean that we were going to start privileging one form of spirituality over other forms of spirituality? And so I saw that as a problem.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It certainly does. To me, the whole debate, I mean, to me, it's a great pity what happened with the letter that you and others wrote to this publication in New Zealand called The Listener, because the furore that erupted over it may have stifled a conversation that seems to me essential for us to have. And, you know, that definition that you gave us of mātauranga Māori from the Royal Society used the word holistic. And this to me is the real crux of the issue. If we say that mātauranga Māori is holistic, it's not so much to me whether, you know, it includes carving and song and so on, because, you know, you could teach a science course and focus on the things that you were talking about, like navigation and herbal remedies and these other things which do evince a great deal of intellectual excellence and utility. But to me, the question is, if mātauranga Māori is holistic in the sense that the material world and the spiritual world are indistinguishable in the way that knowledge is expressed, then we have something that's a fundamental difference with the science, at least, that came out of Europe and Eurasia during the Enlightenment, because that science is predicated on what I would see as Cartesian dualism, the idea that, you know, the material world and the spiritual world are experienced separately. Now, I'm not saying that that's an ideal way to be. I think maybe there's a great deal to learn from Māori in terms of a more holistic approach to life. But I think one of the advantages that we got from dualism was the ability to examine any claim that is made without interference from priesthoods or religion. And so to me, really the essence of scientific inquiry is that there's no such thing as a sacred claim. Anything can be debated, questioned, and subjected to empirical evidence, or to test by empirical evidence. And so that seems to me that the conversation that we really need to have before we can get anywhere in understanding the relationship between these different worldviews.
I would just add as a footnote to that, I think this is a feature of Greek science as well. It's not so much that they didn't have priests and religious experts and they weren't religious people. They had priests, they had religious experts, they had professional soothsayers. The evidence is that they were highly religious. It's just that the religious claims weren't trumping. So they didn't have a large centralized institution like, for example, the Catholic Church in medieval European history that could sort of clamp down on scientific theories and speech. So yeah, I do think that has been a feature of science. But what do you think, Kendall?
Well, yeah, I mean, just think of Galileo. You know, he was, when he suggested that the Earth revolved around the sun rather than the other way around, you know, the Catholic Church said, oh, no, you don't, sonny. You know, and in fact, you know, we're going to come after you big time unless you recant. And so he did actually recant. But this is what the Enlightenment was about. As you say, it kind of separated these things. So there are a number of Maori concepts, particularly whakapapa and Maori, M-A-U-R-I that is, which are definitely span, you know, they kind of inform, they link kind of the spiritual world to their understanding of, shall we say, the material world, if you want to put it that way. And a lot of this has to do with identifying a sense of place. For example, when you do when you introduce yourself, and I do this in lectures, Māori will start with what's called a pepeha, which is like a personal introduction, and you start out by, you know, telling people what about your maunga, your mountain, and that's the mountain that's near to where you were born or you live, at least, your awa, your river, and then you talk about your iwi, your tribe. And when you go through this, there are more complex elements to it, but that's a simple idea of what it's like. And so there is this part of your identity is your mountain, your river. And so this is very important to Māori. And so you can see, so whakapapa is like your genealogy, but to a Māori, that doesn't just mean your family tree. You know, this is my parents, these are my grandparents, etc. It also means your mountain, your river, and so on. And so this is what they mean by holistic. I don't claim to be an expert on this by any means, and I'm absolutely certain that when certain people listen to this podcast, I'm going to be attacked for saying whatever I've just said, but I'm just trying to explain it in as simple as a way as possible. But that's, you know, the concept of Maori. That's the idea that things have a life force, that's common to all different sorts of things, and things that are healthy have a strong Māori, and so it can become almost like a shorthand for environmental health. There are people like Kepa Morgan who actually use this in scientific papers, but it is a spiritual concept. So just getting back to the letter. So when I raised these concerns about how we were going to do this, the person who is now head of our school ethics committee just said, we're not having this conversation, we're not interested in this, we're just going to do this. And so it was just shut down. So when you say we wrote the letter, you know, it was the writing of our letter that shut down the conversation. The conversation was shut down years before the letter. So I spoke to people, particularly my SBS colleague Garth Cooper, who is Maori and who has over 30 years of experience teaching Maori students, consulting with various bodies such as health boards and so on. He's been involved in developing what are called Kaupapa Māori practices, which is like Kaupapa Māori is like how you would conduct a particular type of activity, in this case medical research and teaching, in a way that is kind of kosher to Māori, or consistent with what's called Māori tikanga, their traditional practice. What that means is that you're not doing things that are offensive to Māori. You're doing things that are Māori are going to be comfortable with. And of course, that's the idea. And so he was involved in drafting this. And he shared my concerns. We talked to Mike Corbelis, who was a friend of mine in the School of Psychology. And we brought other people on board. Elizabeth Rata in the Faculty of Education, I got in touch with her because I had seen some of her publications, and there were other people who ended up interested. Garth Robert Nola, who is a distinguished philosopher of science, Mike Corbelis and Elizabeth wrote a paper on this, raising their concerns about this. They submitted it to the Royal Society of New Zealand Journal, and it was rejected after having 7 reviews. Now, I have never heard of a paper submitted to that journal that's had more than 2. I've published in that journal. So having 7 was a bit odd, especially since 3 of them were actually in favour of publication. But the main reason it was rejected was that the editor said, we're rejecting this because you've shown poor scholarship, and we're saying you've shown poor scholarship because you have not used an accepted definition of mātauranga Māori. The problem was that they couldn't use other people were saying mātauranga Māori is science, or it includes science. So the whole point of the paper was to say, well, it includes all sorts of things that aren't science too, and that's the problem. So they were prevented from publishing this. They then tried submitting it somewhere else. It was rejected again for the same reasons. So this reluctance to allow anybody to say anything that was inconsistent with mātauranga Māori is equivalent to science, that was there well before the letter. And really what prompted the letter was earlier this year when a document, an NCEA document was released about what was going to be taught to Māori students.
So we might just say what NCEA is. That's the system for assessing senior secondary school students.
That's right.
Yeah.
High school students.
Yeah.
High school students.
Go ahead.
So the statement said, to ensure parity for mātauranga Māori with the other bodies of knowledge credentialed by NCEA, particularly Western Pākehā epistemologies. So they were starting out by saying, well, we consider science a Western thing, and we consider mātauranga Māori equivalent to that. And they said, it promotes discussion and analysis of the ways in which science has been used to support the dominance of Eurocentric views, among which its use as a rationale for colonisation of Maori and the suppression of Maori knowledge, and the notion that science is a Western European invention and itself evidence of European dominance over Maori and other indigenous peoples. Well, we had a real problem with that because the university quite justifiably wanted to try and increase the proportion of Maori students who were enrolling at university, and we particularly wanted to increase the involvement of Maori in science. And it seemed to us highly unlikely that you're going to encourage Maori students to participate in science if you are telling them that science is a tool of Western oppression and colonisation. That's just, you know,
it's also a bit strange because I thought that you've just laid out that one of the parts of the other side of the argument, the Mātauranga Maori argument, is that Mātauranga Maori does involve science, right? I've seen in some of the responses to your letter, scholars have come forward and said, well, we had the Maori had a highly developed calendar and we could do navigation, and they were calling that science, right? So
yeah,
that seems to be in tension with the claim that science is entirely Western.
Well, okay, I've already raised the issue that a lot of what some of these people say is contradictory. So they will say something at one point and then they will contradict themselves 5 minutes later. There's some of that. But a number of, I'm going to read you a quote from Sir Mason Dury. So this was a document that was published in a Waitangi Tribunal. The Waitangi Tribunal was set up to adjudicate historical grievances, injustices that were suffered by Maori and try to recompense them. For example, stolen land and so on. And so that's what for those non-New Zealanders, that's what the Waitangi Tribunal was about.
And so Mason Dury is a well-respected Māori scholar.
He's a scientist, but he's a well-respected Maori scholar. And so what I'm going to read you is, this is defining Mātauranga Maori. He says, among the key issues identified are these 5. 1, Mātauranga Maori belongs to iwi and should remain under Maori control. I don't know whether you want to comment on these, but quite clearly that contradicts one of the main aspects of science, which is that nobody controls it. That's a principle of universality. So you can't say, well, this is ours and it belongs to us, but it's equivalent to science, because anybody can play the science game. That's not, that's open to anybody. Doesn't matter.
I guess another way of putting that is that any scientific claim needs to be independent of the particular scientist. I mean, obviously scientists have ideas and put them out there to be tested, and then they belong to the scientific community to debate and to collect evidence and so on. Now, of course, we publish papers in our own names, and so we get credit for the things that we've discovered and all of that. But in the end, a theory doesn't belong to anyone. I mean, we might talk about Einstein's theory of relativity, but it's not really Einstein's, it's the world's, right? He's given it to the world, and scientists have got involved and tested and found its limits and all of that.
I like to separate two different issues. There's what Jonathan Rauch in the book that was published earlier this year called The Constitution of Knowledge, he talks about the fallibility rule, which is that the only legitimate ideas have to be put forward for criticism. You can't just say, I'm right, you're wrong, suck it up.
That's also related to Popper's idea of falsifiability, which I think is one of the most genius ideas, because it's so, the reason that I love falsifiability as an idea, so this is the idea that in order to be a legitimate scientific theory, we have to be able to conceive of a way in which it could be proved wrong. Now, not only that, the scientist has to set out to do so, or the scientific community has to set out to do so. In other words, the process of theory testing is not to show that the theory is true, it's to give it your best shot to prove it wrong. And to the extent that it withstands that attempt, it becomes a more valid explanation of phenomena. And what I really love about it is the way in which it pushes back against human biases to want to prove ourselves correct and to want to, show that the idea that we came up with is the best one. Instead, it puts the onus on us to try to knock it down.
Yeah, I will slightly modify that to say that if you're a Bayesian, and I'm sure Robert Knoll would want me to point this out, in a Bayesian framework, it's not a strict falsifiability framework. You could reject a hypothesis because a different hypothesis explains a phenomenon with higher probability.
Sure. I mean, I absolutely take that point. I guess that, I'm making a broader point about the philosophical integrity that comes with that mindset rather than that. I absolutely take the point about the Bayesian details of how you would have competing theories and decide on the basis of prior probabilities but yes.
Right. So all I'm saying is I'm distinguishing between that falsifiability, probability idea and the universality thing, which is that anybody can do it. So one is your ideas have to be open to criticism. You can't say, I've come up with this idea, nobody's allowed to challenge it.
Yes.
Now the two are related.
No sacred claims, right?
No sacred claims, exactly. So the second point, there are signs that the Crown policies for science, research and technology could lead to the assimilation of Mātauranga Maori into mainstream knowledge systems. So he's saying that's a concern. We don't want to do this. 3, Mātauranga Maori is different to science and should not be confused with it. Well, this is exactly what I was saying. Exactly what I was saying.
Yes.
4, Maori participation in science and technology should be encouraged, but it is not a goal which is directly linked to Mātauranga Maori. Fine. Absolutely fine. And then they say, he says, the government bears some responsibility for the protection of Mātauranga Maori and should make funding available for its transmission and development without confusing the issue with Maori participation in science. Excellent.
Indeed.
Totally
agree. I guess we might complicate it slightly by reflecting on what you said at the outset, which is that they may not be completely distinct things. There may well be ways in which Mātauranga Māori overlaps with science and some of its understandings, maybe even some of its methods. And here's another thing that I think is important to put into the conversation when we talk about this. It seems to me that when the word science is used, 2 things might be meant. One is the theories that have come from the scientific methodology that have withstood testing and do a good job of explaining the phenomena of the natural world. The other is the methods of testing themselves. So there's the sort of content knowledge, the things that we know about the world because of the application of the methods of science, and then there's the epistemology of science, which is it's the way in which it tests knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, some people argue that science is more of a social system or a social framework than a particular method.
I don't think it's one particular method. What I do think, though, and of course, nothing is ever sort of rigid, or it shouldn't be rigid, and it shouldn't be fixed. But to me, it's important still to have the formal system sitting in the background to keep us honest. You see what I mean?
This is the notion of challenging ideas. Okay, so we need to do 2 things in this conversation now. First of all, Robert Knoll looked at a lot of the Maori scholarship on the relationship between Mātauranga Maori and science and split it into 2 main groups. Now, there is some overlap between these, and as I said, some people flop from one to the other. But the 2 groups he called the exclusionists, who were people like Mason Jury, Charles Royal, and there are others, including even Linda Smith, basically, who say Mātauranga Maori should be kept distinct from science. They are different. They shouldn't be confused, to use Mason Jury's term. On the other hand, there are the accommodationists, who are the ones that are saying, oh, no, it is science. It's the same as science. We have to consider it equivalent to science, and so on. So there are these 2 different groups, and this is why I said before that anybody who says there is the Maori viewpoint on the relationship between mātauranga Maori and science. There's no such thing, because there's no consistent stance on that. You can read papers that argue, you know, so Robert came up with those two different ways of thinking of it. Now what's happening is that people are saying things like, well, these days there's a sort of a shifting conception of what science is. And Susie Wiles made this statement in an interview for Ingenio magazine a couple of months ago, where she talked about the fact that, you know, where contemporary views of science have changed recently. I'd like to hear what you two think of this, but my take on this is that this is really reflecting kind of the importation of social justice ideology into it, such that you want to be able to say that, well, we're not going to claim that one thing is better than another. I don't have any interest in saying that science is better than mātauranga Maori. To me, that's just a silly statement, because I see them as different.
I agree. Do you want to comment on that first, James? I've got something to say about that, but I'm interested in your view of that.
Well, I mean, I don't know if I want to comment on that, but I mean, in the same article, there was some views put forward by Mattison Russell, who's a philosophy professor at Auckland, and he rightly points out that one of the main arguments for academic freedom is that people can put forward views, and then this then will have a social purpose in leading towards better views. Now, he wants to then take quite a narrow view of what those better opinions are. And I think for me, that's, well, I mean, I can see where he's going, because it's kind of like, okay, the reason we let academics speak is so that we can have can have progress, and so and then he wants to say, well, in that case, if we don't have progress and it's not leading to justice, we have to shut down those views. Now, I think what he's missed is that something which comes out very strongly in intellectual history, which is that we're actually very bad. I mean, we here, meaning all humans, we're very bad at predicting what kinds of ideas are going to turn out to be useful. And as I say, we can see that all the way through intellectual history, that, you know, or even very recently, you know, 10 or 20 years ago, opinions like gay marriage is a good thing, they're very, very hard to speak out loud. And we now look back at, even a couple decades ago, we look back and think, what were we doing? Why were we, you know, why were we suppressing homosexuality in that way? And there are many other examples of this. Of course, we've already had some, even things like, you know, the Earth goes around the sun. That was suppressed.
Well, the idea that a bacterium can be 0.5 millimeter long.
The idea, yeah. And obviously, it doesn't mean that there are lots of crazy theories that sound crazy, and they turn out to be. We still think they're crazy. So it's not like every controversial idea is going to turn out to be true. But I think it's important that this mechanism by which differing views turn out to be helpful, it's a very delicate one, and we have to take quite an expansive view and be very open-minded about what views might turn out to help.
Yeah.
So well, as far as I'm concerned, what I think Mattison Russell is doing is he's saying, so science can have outcomes that are important to people. So what we need to do is a priori make sure that those outcomes are the right outcomes. He is starting with politics, but what's happening these days is the politics are then completely dominating what follows. Now, people will say, well, but all science has values inserted in it somewhere, and people like to bring up eugenics and things like that and so on. I don't think that's a particularly interesting conversation to have, because we don't think that now. So that's an idea that was rejected. There's not much point bringing that up and then saying, effectively, what you're doing is this is part of this problem of the past will be glorified in some respects, but in other respects, particularly insofar as Europeans are concerned, that was really bad news, and aspects of it were really bad news.
Yeah, well, that's right, and science helps us in the longer term overcome the bad ideas and hopefully move towards better ones, at least in terms of the material world. I guess we can raise a valid objection that perhaps it doesn't always lead to better social outcomes. I mean, it can lead to technologies that can have good social effects or bad social effects. That's not it's not the realm of the physical sciences at any rate to concern itself with the social outcomes of the technology that might arise from it. The social sciences, of course, might focus on that. And so there can be a tension between finding out about the world in terms of knowing more about the material world and actually what is good for humans in terms of how they live. And maybe that's something that we can learn something from Mātauranga Māori about. Now, it seems to me that there is an anxiety coming from the exclusionists, as you described them. And maybe this is what sits behind the apparent contradiction between, on the one hand, saying, well, science is this terrible Western construct that dominates Indigenous people, and also it's the same thing as Mātauranga Māori. And maybe one way to resolve that tension is to reflect charitably that actually, you know, the Māori, like other Indigenous peoples, were colonised, and that colonisation experience was not always a good one, that their culture was suppressed, that their land was taken, and so on. And so there's possibly an understandable anxiety that their knowledge systems too might be being colonised and devalued with respect to the worldview of a colonising people. And so if we look at it through that lens, perhaps we can understand at least where they're coming from, even if we disagree or see a contradiction in what they're saying.
Yeah, I don't have any problem with that. I mean, you know, there are values associated with the way that, you know, you consider concepts like whakapapa and so on. It's like the Whanganui River being legally declared, you know, to have essentially to be equivalent to a person in terms of protecting it. That's kind of a good example. But the problem I have, and this is coming back to Jonathan Rauch's ideas, which were inherently political. If you do what Matheson Russell seems to want to do, and you start with the politics, you end up in a situation where everything comes down to essentially a struggle for power, because you don't agree on a common set of facts. So while acknowledging that there are values in science that will be manifest in things like, well, what sorts of activities are we going to fund? In New Zealand, we have a what would it be called? A kind of a system called Vision Mātauranga. Now, that is different to Mātauranga Māori. Vision Mātauranga is the idea that with publicly funded research, because Māori are Indigenous people in New Zealand, if the government is going to invest large amounts of taxpayer money into research, then that research should benefit Māori as well as others. I don't have a problem with that at all. And you know, we have a current MB grant, and we have Māori partners in the seaweed industry. So we you know, we work with Māori on that. So in other words, the idea is if what the research that we're doing is successful, then Māori will be the economic beneficiaries of it. That's fine. I think I have no problem with that at all. That's different to Mātauranga Māori. Some people get those two things confused, but they are quite different. So what then happened, just getting back to the letter story, is so after having this paper rejected and then we saw this NCA statement, Mike Corbelis drafted a letter to the listener and then sent it around a bunch of other people and said, who wants to sign this? And I had a look at it, and I was a bit concerned with a couple of the statements, and we actually modified statements. Some of the modifications that we made have been, in other words, to try and ensure that people didn't take it the wrong way, that we weren't criticising Mātauranga Māori, that we weren't saying it had no value, which is what the Royal Society said about it. I mean, they claimed that our letter said that Mātauranga Māori had no value. Well, our letter does not say that anywhere.
I mean, that's tantamount to an outright lie, isn't it?
Well, I think so. Yeah, I think it is. Well, perhaps another way of putting it is that it misrepresented what we said. But we didn't actually say it, so it is a fabrication. The Royal Society's statement, which when I last looked was still on their website, so what they say, we never said.
We didn't say.
We should also say that, yeah, the Royal Society is an institution in New Zealand that is supposed to defend and further science. Just for
it's kind of ironic, isn't it? I mean, the other thing that they're doing is they are currently investigating since the sad death of our friend Mike Corbelis a couple of weeks ago. There are 2 remaining fellows of the Royal Society who signed the original letter, Garth Cooper and Robert Nola. They are both being investigated, and with a view to expelling them. And this is because of what we said in the letter. So this is now, there is now some discussion of this. So I don't know, I'd be interested to hear what you guys think, but I've been told all sorts of things. I have, the one thing that hasn't happened is nobody's come up to me and said, oh, you're a total asshole for saying this, you know, you should never have said this was appalling, you're a racist. Nobody's done that. I've said that in Twitter, but just for those of our critics who are listening, I'm not on Twitter, so they can do what they like in that cesspit. I don't.
That makes 2 of us, mate.
Yeah. I'm just staying well out of that. So
I think that's actually a very healthy response, and you might think that this might also be the appropriate response from institutions. That, I mean, I would defend people's rights to say what they like on Twitter, even about academics, even though I encourage them to actually, engage with people's actual arguments. But then the correct response from an institution like the Royal Society should surely be, to look at the arguments and to look at the science and to defend scientists and especially its own members' ability to have their say.
Yes, and I think there's a lot of water to flow under the bridge yet on how the Royal Society came to publish that statement attacking us in the way they did, and then go on to launch these investigations. I think there will be, I think there's a lot that we as New Zealand taxpayers who fund, so we're funding the Royal Society, they are arguably doing the opposite of what they are meant to be doing. But as I said, lots more to come in that space. Yeah. So what did happen is we got hundreds of emails from the general public, from other academics saying, good on you, agreeing with us. These are people who would agree with us privately, but not publicly. There are a whole bunch of people in the Royal Society who have told us that they don't see anything wrong with what we said. They think we've raised a legitimate question and a question that should be discussed, but they don't want to say that publicly.
I mean, that in itself is a signal or a sign of a real malady in our body politic, isn't it? Where people are too frightened to speak their minds in a democracy. I mean, what have we come to? That this is the situation where people, even other distinguished academics will write to you and say, oh, I completely agree with what you said, but I'm too scared to speak up about it.
Well, I refer to this like an iceberg. So what's projecting above the surface of the water are the small number of people who were prepared to come out, maybe because we're just fundamentally stupid or something like that, but we're prepared to come out and make public statements because we thought it was important. That's the bit above the water. What's underneath the water are the vast majority of people who are too frightened to say anything because they're intimidated. Now, some of them may agree to some extent with our critics, but some of what's been said about us, is really pretty appalling. The words like violence, abuse, racism, white supremacy are thrown around all the time. Yeah. And this is just utterly ridiculous, especially when you consider the enormous career contribution that Garth in particular has made to teaching Maori students, encouraging Maori students, trying to get them interested and involved in science. And one of the things, I mean, people can call me nasty names, you know, that's okay. But the thing that has really kind of hurt me, especially with Mike's death, is the way they talked about him.
Yes.
You know, you wouldn't meet a kinder, more gentle, wise man. And
no, that's right. I mean, I feel a particular sense of sadness about that too, because I'm like him. I'm a cognitive psychologist, and I first met Michael Kabalis when I was a PhD student at a conference in Australia, and he was always an incredibly generous man, and with his time, with his intellect, and of course a giant in his field. And so now, you know, it's a kind of strange situation for me to find myself in a different realm, kind of engaged with his work, which is to say the work of making sure that public discourse can take place in a way that is untrammeled by this kind of nastiness that you've all been subject to. It's hard for me to see how we can go on as a democracy for very long if this kind of way of doing business takes root.
So if I just twist what you said slightly,
yeah,
there's another interesting point that we can make here, and that is that this is Jonathan Rauch's point. The reason why he thought these principles of fallibility and universality were so important to a democracy is because we do not want to end up where the United States is at the moment, where you've got essentially this highly polarized community that essentially believe two totally separate sets of facts. And this is why, while acknowledging that values kind of seep into science, we should be trying to keep that as neutral as possible. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't prioritize research in areas of most importance to people. But it does mean that if we have one group of people saying, I'm right, you're wrong, I get to say this, you don't, we're screwed.
And that certainly is not science.
Well, it's not science.
And neither is democracy.
So this is why in our letter, we said, where is it? That Indigenous knowledge is critical for the preservation and perpetuation of culture and local practices, and plays key roles in management and policy. Now, management and policy typically come after the science. So that's the way it should work. So scientists don't make policy, although some end up in policy, you know, as in, for example, fisheries research. What's happened with a lot of this debate about Mātauranga Māori versus science is that our critics are attacking a caricature or a straw man of science. They're saying, oh, no, they don't care about sustainability, and this is all about exploitation. It's all their fault that we've got climate change and all of this sort of stuff. That they don't, you know, that science is reductionistic, and so they don't think of the bigger picture. That's just nonsense. Yes. Contemporary fisheries research, for example, involves environmental ecosystem management. So, for example, when in Niwa these days, they are considering a stock of commercial fish species like hoki or hake, they will also consider the populations of prey species like lanternfish and so on that support these. They will consider the productivity right from, you know, the microscopic algae floating in the surface water that are eaten by zooplankton, how they are fed on by lanternfish, and how that goes through food chains up to things like the commercial species. So this is captured. That is not to say that ideas from Mātauranga Māori can't inform science. I've already talked about that. I started out by talking about that because I wanted to make sure I made that point. I didn't forget to acknowledge that. However, if we're going to include ideas that Mātauranga Māori belongs, I mean, there's a lot of criticism of anybody who expresses a view on Mātauranga Māori who isn't Māori. Well, you can't have your cake and eat it too on that. If that's what you're going to say, don't turn around and start saying it's equivalent to science. It's not.
Because then you make sacred claims once again.
Yeah. You can't. So this is like, essentially, this is trying to have your cake and eat it too. And I think that's a big problem. But we have a bigger problem here, which is just this issue, and you know, I'd like to hear what you two think of the solution to this. Is so there are a lot of people who are very concerned about being called nasty names on social media. And, you know, I think the correct response, as John McWhorter says, is just to say, well, I'm taking a rational approach to things. I don't think I'm a racist, and you can call me that if you want to, but I'm not going to let that worry me because I'm not actually being a racist. But there are a lot of people for whom that's a problem. And many colleagues have said, well, my position hasn't been confirmed yet. I don't have tenure yet. You know, you're a professor. You can get away with saying things like that. Look, my position in my school has been seriously damaged by this. I mean, I've been chucked out of teaching first year classes. I've been chucked out of teaching second year classes. A number of people didn't think we should be allowed to teach at all or supervise graduate students because of what we said.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's ridiculous and it's silly, and I've had some experience with this myself in my own field, because in classics as well, there's a lot of discourse about the field is intrinsically white supremacist. It's actually really interesting because you have all these fields where people are saying this field by its nature is intrinsically white supremacist, such as classics and biology. And then there's so many claims like that at the moment you start to think, well, there are two possibilities here. One is that all our fields are intrinsically white supremacist. That's a possibility. I think that's their theory, that it's all because of Western science and the way we do scholarship. The other possibility is that it's a kind of fad that various people in different, it's sweeping various fields, and so everybody's using the same language. So I think that's a possibility we should hold out. But yeah, what you do about people calling you, I mean, it's obviously a terrible thing that, I mean, the level of the problem isn't, so initially people would say, oh, it's just random people on Twitter, don't worry about it. It's like, you know, some guy on Twitter with 3 followers calling you a racist. No, actually, it's sort of people who have academic jobs in my field in the States are calling you racist. And that is a bit of a problem. But I think the really sad thing, and the point at which it becomes a real problem, isn't the sort of mudslinging thing. The mudslinging thing in itself, I would even defend, because it is sort of free expression in some way, even though I think that academics would have a higher bar for the points that they make. The point at which it becomes a problem is when the institutions are craven and cowardly, and when they give in to this kind of thing. So obviously this, you know, if you make a reasonable academic argument in a letter or an article, and then people go online and say you're a racist, they should lose face for that. And certainly what should not happen is that you face sanctions, in my humble opinion.
Or your vice chancellor should go on public record implying that you're racist.
Well, I don't know that she said that.
She didn't say that, but
she did say that we had caused considerable hurt and distress. I mean, in more recent media interviews, like the Times Higher Education article that was published a few weeks ago, she said that we didn't do anything wrong, and that what we were saying raised an important point that needed to be discussed. I'm looking forward to seeing some evidence of that discussion being promoted, because certainly what is happening in my school is this is just one-way traffic. We're now incorporating Mātauranga Māori throughout our curriculum, and without any, well, as far as I can, there's not been any discussion of, I'm not allowed to say anything, basically. I mean, I just get told, no, we're not relitigating that, we've made that decision, and these are the sorts of things I get told.
So that's
I get told I don't know anything about Mātauranga Māori, despite the fact that I've read dozens of these papers, and we've written tons of stuff on it and so on. As I say, I'm not claiming any expertise in particular, but I do listen to people like Garth, who is Maori and has taught Maori for over 3 decades. I listen to people like Robert Nola, who is a distinguished philosopher of science, whose specialty is epistemology and thinking about these questions. But I also listen to people like Mason Jury and Charles Royal, who are Maori scholars who, as far as I'm concerned, are saying exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah. So we probably better wrap up. It's been a marvellous conversation, and one of the most exciting ones we've had on Free Kiwis, in my opinion, as evinced by the fact that we could probably go on for another hour, but we better get on with our various duties. But thank you so much, Kendall, for joining us today. It's been terrific.
I will look out for this big bacterium. I didn't even know it was out there. So thanks for that, and for being so open in your conversation.
Well, thanks very much for the opportunity, and you know, I just hope we can get to a place where people can discuss this without fear.
It's a hope. All right.